Uh, Ladies and gentlemen, yes, if everybody can please take their seats. We are going to try to give it a start because unfortunately, before starting, we are already late, almost half an hour on our schedule, which is going to introduce an extra challenge to an already very challenging morning. Welcome to everybody. Thanks for being here this morning and for taking interest in this topic, which, as we are going to see in a short moment, it's extremely relevant and very important and high in the Commission agenda, in the political agenda of the European Union. My name is Raquel Cortés Herrera. I am the Deputy Head of Unit of the Disability and Inclusion Unit in DG Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion. And I am here replacing Emmanuel Grange, who was supposed to chair this meeting or co-chair this meeting this morning, but unfortunately was kept by an unforeseen urgency needing her attention, and so has asked me to replace her. So she's apologizing for that and wishing you and us all a very fruitful discussion this morning. I am going to be co-chairing this session with Jana Hainsworth, who is sitting on my left, and is the Secretary General of Eurochild, so a very relevant organization for the topic we are discussing in this forum, and a close partner of the Commission in developing policies that ensure the respect of children's rights. The first thing that I would like to do is to go quickly through a few housekeeping instructions that should help us to go through this session efficiently. First of all, the session is going to have 7 panelists, plus the co-chair that is also going to intervene, each of which has 15 minutes to speak. I really would like to ask all of them to stick to the time that they are given, because as you can see, it's a very busy agenda. We have a lot of topics to hear about and to discuss, and if the speakers do not stick to the time, it's going to be difficult to manage. So please, all of you, there is going to be some timekeeping done for you, so you are going to receive signals when you have 5 minutes, 3 minutes, and 1 minute left. Katarina down there is going to be taking care of that. So please pay attention to the signals when they come. We have discussed with Jana, and we are proposing to divide the session in 2 blocks. One before the coffee break and the other one after the coffee break. So we will have a series of presentations, one after the other, followed by a Q&A time for each of the 2 blocks. This is also why it's important to keep the time, so that we ensure that we have sufficient time for questions and answers, and that the session can be as interactive as possible, even though with the number of persons in the room, interactivity is always a challenge. I'd like to remind everybody that when taking the floor, please remember switching on the microphone. That is very important because the session is being recorded and web streamed, and only when using the microphone this can happen. If you speak out of the microphone, there is no recording and no web streaming. So please remember to do that every time. The coffee break will be approximately between 11:20 and 11:40. The different coffee breaks of the different sessions have been décalés in order to ensure that there is not too many people outside at the same time. So we will need to respect those times as well. And please be back in the room on time so that we can continue with the rest of the session. For those that have not yet done it, you can use the coffee break for networking, of course, but also for visiting the publications room, which is 0C. And that should be an interesting place to have a look to. And then remember also that the forum has an application that you can be using not only to reach all the background documents, but also because you can connect and chat to each other through the application, I am told. Haven't tried it myself, but maybe I will. And also to reply to the survey questions that are going to be available in the application. So I think that I am not forgetting anything as far as the housekeeping rules are concerned. On my side, I am going to be extremely short because I think that what is interesting this morning is to listen to what our panelists have to say. As just a matter of a very brief introduction from the Commission side, I would just like to remind everybody that in spite of some progress that has been recently done, we still estimate that in the European Union we have around 500,000 kids that are currently living in institutions for various reasons. Some of them are there because they are kids with special needs, the parents of whom do not get sufficient support from community-based systems to be able to take care of them outside these institutions. Some of them are there because of reasons of material deprivation that make that the parents are not able to care for their children's needs on their own and therefore place them in the institutions. There might be other reasons as well. However, it is clear that we need to work all together, the European Union level, the other administration levels in the member states, the civil society, the NGOs, the academia, everybody, in order to find efficient ways to prevent this from happening. As you know, the European Union tries to play its part in this process mainly through providing member states with policy guidance, which in this case would be basically our Investing in Children recommendation from 2013, as well as from with the European funds that can be devoted to social objectives, but I think that Ander will probably talk more about that. And in the foreseeable future, the Commission is going to be working in a preparatory action adopted by the European Parliament on the so-called child guarantee, which, among other things, is going to be looking at the situation of children in institutions and how this situation can be improved and how the rights of the children that are currently placed in institutions can be effectively ensured. But today is not about the Commission, it's not about what we are proposing or what we are doing. Today we want to hear from you what you expect, what you propose, what you can input to this discussion, what you expect from newly adopted initiatives, for instance, like the Pillar of Social Rights that hopefully is going to be proclaimed in a few days in Gothenburg. The work-life balance initiative, for instance, was part of this package, etc. So the main actors today are you. And without further ado, I would like to pass the floor to the co-chair of the session for her opening statement.
Thank you very much, Raquel, and very warm welcome to all of you. Thank you for choosing this workshop in the very important Children's Rights Forum. Firstly, I wanted to really acknowledge DG Justice and the Children's Rights team in the Fundamental Rights Unit in DG Justice. Marta, I think she's just nipped out of the room, but I think it's been very courageous of them to fill this Child Rights Forum with a combination of very important issues under the heading of deprivation of liberty and alternatives to detention. And I think when we've been talking with their team and preparing for this Child Rights Forum, it's very important that we're thinking in the frame of children in institutions, also in the context of deprivation of liberty and alternatives. Because although they might not be in cells and they might not be locked up, it is a lot about control and not allowing the full development of a child's autonomy and not allowing them to grow to their full potential. So I think it's really important. It's very challenging to put so many agendas into this topic these 2 days, but I really hope that the discussion that we have this morning is contributing to their reflection on taking this issue forward and how we can embed this agenda in a children's rights perspective. Ending institutional care has been on the EU's priority for quite a number of years. I want to also acknowledge Lumos at the beginning in 2009. There was an ad hoc group focused on transition from institutional to community-based care. What it's done is been really important, drawing a link between the narrative of human rights from many different vulnerable groups who are exposed to institutional care. And that group has transformed into now the European Expert Group on the transition from institutional to community-based care. And it combines many different networks working for the rights of people with mental health issues, people with disabilities, the elderly, children. It's a very wide connecting piece of how we can really transform how we care for people with care needs and vulnerable people in our societies. And that work has been absolutely crucial for putting this on the agenda of the EU, and it has notably contributed to very important regulations in the use of structural funds, which Andor is going to talk about, which has been introduced in this current phase of the financial framework of the EU, which we're currently monitoring. And I think also in the background documents to today's session, you have 11 references to EU policies, legislative pieces that are saying to member states, and indeed to the neighbourhood and the accession countries too, that we are all in a move towards transforming our welfare and our protection systems towards more personalised services, towards more community-based services. And this is absolutely something that the EU has as its vision, and we are trying to support them in helping member states make those kinds of reforms. So today we're very much talking about child protection, child welfare reforms. We're also talking about children with disabilities and supports for their families. And we're talking about how we can transform our systems and our services to enable more personalised care, to move away from this depersonalised routine, rotation of staff, inability to build relationships with adults, the whole purpose of building more autonomy for each individual child, and therefore enabling them to really fulfil their potential and grow into contributing adults and integral part of our societies. Our fundamental basis for this work is, as you are all aware, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the subsequent UN guidelines on alternative care, which sets out two key principles, the first being necessity. So a child should never be placed in any kind of external care to the home unless it's absolutely in the best interest of the child and necessary. That means that we need to ensure every kind of provision and support is available to the family, whether that's families who are struggling materially, financially, whether they are struggling because a child has particular special needs or is disabled. And all of those services need to be wrapped around how we can support families and parents in their parenting role. And the second principle is suitability. So and this really should be a small number of children that have to be removed from their families, that the care for that child is suitable. And of course, we're all aware, the UNCRC says the best place for a child to grow up is in a family environment which can provide the individualised love and nurturing that a child deserves and needs. So that's the framing for us going into this work. As Raquel said, I'm Secretary General of Eurochild. We are a membership network of organisations promoting children's rights. We have members across 33 European countries. But in this context, we're also working very closely with 4 other international organisations on a campaign called Opening Doors for Europe's Children. So it's specifically focused on ending institutional care and strengthening families. We have in the partnership Hope and Homes for Children, SOS Children's Villages, FISE Europe, and the International Foster Care Organisation. But I'd say most importantly, and this is actually fundamental to the principle of how Eurochild works, is the drive is from national level. So it's about national NGO organisations leading the advocacy on reform of their child protection and welfare systems, doing what they need to do at national level to influence and hopefully work in partnership with governments, and using to the best possible way the leverage that we do have at European Union level in terms of policy, politics, and very importantly, the funding that we have. So I hope that in this session today we can also think together. Raquel said this is not about the European Commission, it's also about hearing you. But we also want to get some messages back to the European Commission because they are very, very important in being a catalyst in this agenda. So I really hope that we will move this forward. Just very lastly, I wanted to say, we have been spoken to a lot over the last 2 days. It's been very intense. And I hope that we will have time for discussion. We have a good mix of people in the room. We have NGOs, we have government representatives, we have hopefully children's ombudspersons play a very critical role, academics, some Council of Europe, international organisations, and I hope a couple of people from the European Commission, not only DG Employment, Regio, Justice, also DG Research. So please, I hope we will have time for questions and comments and debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jana, for setting very well the framework of the discussions that we are going to have here this morning. I think that you have already highlighted a lot of important elements that are going to be developed by our speakers as we go along. But before turning to the experts, I would like to start the session welcoming a personal testimony. We have with us, and we are very pleased to have with us Pavel Hajek. Do I correctly pronounce it? How do you pronounce your name?
Pavel Hayek.
Hayek, okay. Who is a self-advocate from the Czech Republic.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, my name is Pavel. I'm 21 years old, and I live in institution since my 14. I would like to speak about my life in children's home. I would like to mention things that I think are somehow interesting or think it's completely different than my classmates or family friends. I came to my children's home at the age of 14. My mom was sick and it was really hard to be at home, but no one asked me what exactly I wanted, and everyone decided for me. I think at the age of 14, one knows what he wants or not, and he has the right to say it. There are lot of things in the children's home. One of the biggest difference is there are a lot of us. In a children's home, children are divided into groups of 8. I think that's too much. I think one living room and one kitchen is too small for so many people. Now I have a room for myself, but when I was younger, it was different. I'm happy with the others, but the problem is that there are so many people, it's noisy. I cannot concentrate on so many people all at once, and I do not have a perfect relationship with everybody. Previously, we had 2 or 3 showers side by side, and we were showering together. Even today, we are going to get into the bathroom, and we do not think about the privacy because it's normal. Sometimes it's hard for me to recognize what is right and what is not. This year I started work with Lumos, which wants to change the system and help children live in families. I'm a member of Youth Advertising Board, and I would like to tell you what my colleagues think. We discussed two questions. What does it mean be deprived of the liberty? And what if the walls fall down and we are free? We looked at the two questions from three view of the small children in institution, our view, youth advertising board, and view of the society, how the society should think about this problem. Our view, what does it mean to be deprived of the liberty? Somebody said that it is not possible to completely deprive it of the liberty of anyone. We are free as we have a free mind, and we agree, but the liberty can be greatly reduced. When the liberty is resisted, one of the highest and the most valuable values we have in our lives is denied it. The deprivation of liberty should be a punishment for crimes, and this should end. To be distracted to freedom means for us not to be taken seriously, defying our individuality and defamation of our basic human rights. What if the wall fall and we are free? We should be very happy about our freedom. After the fall of the wall, it's difficult to tread our freedom at once. It's too big shock. We suddenly do not know what we are and what we want. What now? Now to deal with our life. We need support and help, and especially it's important to understand what this freedom is from our childhood. From the perspective of Nick, how can a child see it in institution care? What does it mean to be deprived of liberty? It means shooting someone in a cage and telling him what to do. Do not let go, forbid to say what I think, and intimidate me. What if the walls fall and you are free? Nobody is nobody is bad for me anymore. No one forbids me. I can do what I want. View of the society. What does it mean to be deprived of liberty? Our society has a opportunity to try to be deprived of freedom. Some people satisfied their lives for liberty. It shows the liberty is something very important for people. The freedom of society reflects the value of the moral act, and the lack of the liberty reduces the quality of the society. What if the walls fall and we are free? It means a better life, but also possible complications. What the society can do to help children and to remove the wall with the respect and support. And now I would like to show you video what we made with my friends.
Pusťte nás! Já chci pryč! Já chci pryč!
A dost, 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 dost. And that was everything from me. Thank you.
Many thanks, Pavel. we really appreciate that you wanted to share with us your experience, because indeed, for most of us, freedom and liberty, it's a given. It's something that we do not question, that we have always lived with. And I think it's very instructive and eye-opening for all of us to listen to a direct testimony of someone for whom things have been different, and that is fighting for those that are experiencing this same situation that is unknown to us, but that thanks to you and to your generosity of being here today, we can at least, have a hint about how does it feel. Thanks a lot for that. And now I will start with the members of our panel of experts. We are going to start listening to Georgette Mulhar. She is the director of Lumos, which is, as I'm sure you all know, an organization supporting children worldwide to regain a family and to leave the institutions they are placed in for the time being. The history of Lumos is rich, and they have contributed to this topic and to this policy development of the whole policy of deinstitutionalization since a long time, as Jana was just mentioning before, not the least by making reports, as the last one they prepared in partnership with Open Homes, in which they do highlight some of the most crucial issues and make some recommendations also to the European Union on how to support child protection and care systems and reform of DI. So I'm very much looking forward to listen to what you have to say, Georgette.
I can promise you I'm not going to speak for 15 minutes because I had an opportunity yesterday. I know not everybody was at the side event, but I don't want to repeat everything that I said yesterday. So today I just want to highlight really a few areas that I hope we will discuss in the Q&A session. I also want to say thank you very much to Pavel for coming from the Czech Republic and for working together with your colleagues to try to express and think about what does it mean to be free. And I think that one of the challenges for the Czech Republic is that, and it is a challenge for the European Union, is that actually a huge amount of EU money was poured into improving the institutional system. So in the Czech Republic, hundreds of millions of euro were poured into improving buildings, to trying to make them smaller, to make them into small apartment-like institutions. And this is where Pavel was living. And Pavel has just said to us, there were 8 people. Now, lots of the institutions that in their section of the institution, there were 8 people. Lots of institutions that we're involved in closing and that people write reports on, there's 100 or there's 150. And people think, well, the solution is change this into apartments of 8 and so on. And I can't tell you how many countries I've seen this happening, where people think the solution is modifying and improving because people struggle to envisage a system without actually putting these separating children from families and putting them in these buildings. And it's our lack of imagination that results in a huge amount of money being poured into the wrong thing. And someone like Pavel telling us, and then think about it from your point of view as a child. No one asked you what you wanted. You were taken away from your mom because she had some housing problems and some difficulties, not because she's a bad mother, not because she's a bad person, not because you're a bad person. You haven't committed a crime and they take you to a diagnostic centre. What on earth is a diagnostic centre? That's rhetorical because I actually know, because we've spent a lot of time in the Czech Republic. But how can anything called a diagnostic centre be home? So, and what does home mean? And the first thing that happens to someone like Pavel when taken to a diagnostic centre is he's locked in. And there are very strict rules. And he feels like he's in prison. And then he starts to wonder what crime he's committed, as he told us so eloquently. I hadn't committed a crime, but I wasn't free. Now, why is the Czech Republic doing this? And I'm highlighting the Czech Republic because we had this personal testimony. But this is happening in pretty much every country in the world in one way or another. Why are they doing this? They're doing this because they're saying, well, we need to assess, we need to find out what's wrong, we need to try and find a solution for Pavel. So the intention is actually quite a good one. The intention is saying that Pavel's family has got a problem and we need to find a solution for that. And so the way we find a solution is we take him from his family and we lock him up. So we start with an intention that's quite good and immediately go to what is actually deprivation of liberty. So I don't want to focus only on Pavel. So what does it feel like when you come in to an institution for the first time as a child? Well, first of all, you don't understand what's happened to you because nobody's explained. Very, very rarely does anyone actually explain to you why you've been taken away from your family. So you don't understand. The second thing that happens, so you're traumatized, you're missing your family, you're missing what you're used to, and you are scared and you're confused and you feel isolated. But the first thing you have to do is learn the rules. Now, no one will actually sit down and tell you what the rules are, but the first thing you have to do is learn the rules, otherwise you won't eat, you won't sleep, you won't have anything. And so you're shocked into this set of circumstances where it's immediately into survival mode. And this is what happens to children when they end up in an institution. The first thing they're having to do is to go into survival mode and to learn what the rules are around them. And the rules are often very, very confusing. And they're very different from the rules of normal family and from the rules of society. So one of the things that Pavel and his colleagues told us is that we do want to be freed. We don't want to be deprived of our liberty. We want the walls of the institutions to come down. But that in itself brings problems because, and this happens frequently to kids who are in institutions, that at the age of 16 or 18, suddenly you're out on the street. Very rarely with any support. You might have been given some other housing, you might not, but very rarely with any supports. And suddenly you're in a society that you've been kept away from for quite some time and you don't know the rules. And this is part of why young people who leave institutions struggle so much. They're traumatized by what has happened to them. When they've been in survival mode in the institution, it's very difficult to learn and grow and develop. And we know from all of the evidence that institutions harm the health and development of children. And then you're let out at 18 and nobody's told you how to survive in this world outside the institution. And quite often what's happened is the institution itself was maybe 100 kilometres away from your family. Even if they intended to visit you, that hasn't happened much and the relationships have broken down. So the normal social structures that you have to help guide us through those first sort of 5 years or so, from 18 to 23, 24, that are quite tough for us. I don't know how many people in this room were completely independent at 18, but I wasn't. Those are quite tough years, and we have family support networks, we have friends, and we have people in society, but we also have a lot of knowledge. We know how to buy a bus ticket. We know how to go shopping. There are all sorts of things that you just learn by doing, by osmosis, by being in a family environment. Now, I do not want in any way to pretend that all families are perfect. They are not. My own family is by far from perfect. And we had a complicated and dysfunctional childhood growing up, which I could tell you about another time. But the one thing I will say is that my family was surrounded by a huge amount of violence. There was a lot of violence in my extended family, and my father and mother were not, but we witnessed a lot. And when I say violence, I mean I witnessed, my 7-year-old cousin being punched in the stomach by her father. I witnessed my uncle kicking his wife to the ground and jumping up and down on her. I witnessed my grandfather beat my grandmother when she was blind. Now, the reason I'm telling you all these things is that violence is not good to grow up around. I don't want you to feel sorry for me. There's nothing to feel sorry for. But I'm telling you now, there's no way I should have been removed from my family and put in an institution. I was raised really, really well. So my point is that there are terrible things that happen in families, absolutely terrible. But what are we doing if our automatic response is to remove a child from a violent environment or an abusive environment or a chaotic environment. What we have to do is see, first of all, what's happening to that child, how well are they developing, how are the parents doing, what can change, what can be improved, and that's where we need to focus our attentions and efforts. Now, the reason I'm also saying that is because when we go down this road of our horrible, terrible word that no one seems to come up with a better one, of deinstitutionalisation, when we go down this road, the first thing people think that is about, well, first of all, they think it's about improving institutions, and they paint walls and turn them into apartments, and then they realise actually, because young people like Pavel will tell you, this is not the right thing and this has not actually helped me. So then we go down the road of saying, well, let's replace it with something else. Let's replace it with small group homes. Let's replace it with foster care. We're starting at the wrong end. The place where we need to start is at the family and the community. So before we start thinking about what other care services do we need, we should be looking at what is it that families and communities are lacking and how do we help them. And what we have found is when you look at it from that angle to start with, and when you help a country to strengthen and make more accessible its health and education systems, when you start there, you actually significantly reduce the number of children who are coming into the care system. If we look at a country like Moldova, roughly half of the children in institutions, and these were really terrible places, roughly half were children in residential special schools who had a diagnosis of some kind of disability, and there was no inclusive education in the community. Solving and putting in place an inclusive education system in Moldova has been one of the biggest keys to actually significantly reducing the numbers of children in institutions. It's now down by 85%, and 10 years ago it had the highest rate of the whole of the European region per capita. So these changes are possible by actually looking at what are those structural and community causes of children being taken away from their families. Then, of course, we do need to have alternatives, as Jana was saying earlier, for those children who absolutely cannot stay with their family, but those alternatives need, as far as possible, to be based on family and community. Imagine what it had been like for Pavel or someone like Pavel, who, if he had to be removed from his family, if he's taken into a family and the first thing they're doing is giving you a normal environment and saying, don't worry, it's going to be okay. And these are kind and caring and loving people. Imagine the difference of what that feels like just to go into a normal family home. It's strange still, it's not your family, but it is a world apart from being locked up and treated like a criminal. Whatever the intention of those institutions is, what it is doing is locking children up. And so many kids I've worked with over the years will ask the question, what did I do wrong? Very often institutional systems will actually, as Pavel said, put together children who have committed a criminal offence with children who have not. And this is another reason why children who've not committed any crime whatsoever start to feel like that they are criminals. When we talk about deprivation of liberty, and I think Renata Winter said it very, very well earlier on, part of the reason I think why member states, UN member states, have not put their money and support so far behind the global study on children deprived of liberty is because the institutionalisation of children, the separation of them from families and community, the placement of them in an institutional environment for whatever reason, essentially labels them, and we all start to think there must be something wrong with these children. So while the children are saying, what have we done wrong? Society generally is saying, well, there must be something wrong with them, or they must have done something wrong, otherwise they wouldn't be in the institution, right? So we have this problem now that as a society, we label and view these kids as there's something wrong with them. And then when you go into an institution and you see challenging behaviours, and when you see children tied up because they're self-harming, and when you see children who are doped out of their heads on psychotropic drugs to control their behaviour, and then when you see children with the stereotypical behaviours that they have because of institutionalisation, and you see them rocking back and forth and smacking themselves in the faces, then our view is reinforced. There must be something, of course there's something wrong with these children, and therefore their institutionalisation is justified. So what we are doing is, we are doing the typical thing of blaming the victim for their victimisation, and we are also normalising locking children up and throwing away the key. Because the last thing I would say about this is that when you put a child in an institution, for whatever reason, that's usually a sentence for their entire childhood. And for children with disabilities, that's often a life sentence. Because usually what happens is that when they turn 18, they are moved to the adult section of the institution or to an adult institution. And very often they'll stay there until they die. So when we talk about a care system, when we talk about child welfare, we imagine all kinds of things that are related to the good and positive intent of helping and supporting people who are vulnerable. And it's such a dystopia to go behind the walls of these places and see what the reality actually is for children, that I think it's hard for people to believe that it's the truth. So it's been so important the last few days to be hearing all the testimony, and I just do want to remind people very quickly of some of the really common traits of institutionalisation. Deprivation of liberty. So it is really frequently the case that even when institutions are not there specifically as secure institutions, that actually they're locked facilities. And people will say, well, we have to do that because we've got 8-year-olds. We can't have them running off on their own, so we have to lock the doors. But what does that feel like for children? I've seen so many institutions where if you want access to the bathroom, you have to ask a member of staff to unlock it. If you want to get some water from the kitchen has to be unlocked. These are locked facilities. Frequently, institutions have high walls, they have guards. In many countries, the guards have weapons. Another common one is physical restraint. We keep seeing it, cage beds, straitjackets, ties, and as well as psychotropic drugs to control behaviour. I have seen commonly used as punishments things that would officially be defined as torture. Food deprivation, sleep deprivation, taking children's shoes away so that they can't run away from the institution. These are commonly used, and I have seen in many institutions actual punishment rooms or punishment cells. And these are not supposed to be for children who've committed a crime. Exploitation of labour, I see this in so many countries where children are essentially working for long hours in many different ways to make money for the institution. Exposure to a very high risk of physical and sexual abuse, much, much higher in institutions globally than it is in families. Force feeding, I talked about it yesterday. In order to get enough food down children's mouths in a short space of time, children are force fed, and it is one of the most horrific things you can ever see happening to a child. And very, very high mortality rates. Reminding you in the Canadian residential schools, in Canada, if you were serving in the war, you had a better likelihood of surviving that as a soldier than you did as an Indigenous child in a Canadian residential school. 1 in 25 children died there. So let's remember that this is what it means to live in an institution. These are the common traits, and they are all much more what we would imagine to be in a prison camp than an institution. Thanks very much.
Many thanks, Georgette, for your intervention, which on the one hand was very down to earth and very, as I said before, for Pavel's intervention, eye-opening in the sense that you gave us a very good insight of what does actually institutionalization mean. But on the other hand, had also a component of optimism, since you told us that this can be changed and there are examples of success in modifying this type of systems. So from here we are going to pass to our next speaker, that is Steve Allen. Thanks, Steve, for being with us. Steve is the Executive Director of Mental Disability Advocacy Center. He has a substantial experience in monitoring of places of detention and has a very personal commitment, I understand, to this whole topic, since he was in the past having a known experience supporting his mother, who lived with mental health issues and was, I understand, for some time also in detention in psychiatric institutions. So he's at the same time an expert and a testimony, I would say. So thanks a lot to Stephen. The floor is yours for 15 minutes.
Thank you very much. And also thank you very much to DG Justice for the organising of this fantastic event. I think it's been wonderful conversations over the last couple of days, but as Georgette mentioned, in a very, very difficult area where we are talking about children, we are talking about children who are deprived of their liberty and separated from their families, separated from their communities, and separated, in many cases, from their own futures. I'm Stephen Allen, and at the Mental Disability Advocacy Centre, we focus primarily on the human rights of children and adults with mental disabilities, by which I refer to children with intellectual disabilities, children with cognitive impairments, those with developmental disabilities, as well as children who have complex, multiple and profound disabilities. And it's perhaps for these groups of children where we see some of the most kind of extreme forms, I think, of deprivation of liberty, often starting at a very, very young age. And Georgette has already pointed out to the issues faced by children in the Czech Republic, for example. I'm also going to touch on this as well. Briefly, our organisation is not involved with service provision, okay? So we are actually a human rights organisation. And we were established in 2002 in Budapest specifically to tackle the long histories in that region of the world of segregation of people with mental disabilities. So their long-term institutionalisation, as well as their denial of access to basic public services. Our main focus has remained on Central and Eastern Europe, and as much as I would like to say that there has been a lot of positive developments, I'm afraid we still see some of the same challenges today, and in some cases we are also seeing retrogression, I have to point out. Retrogression in terms of the basic protection of human rights. So we work with 3 basic programs to tackle the segregation of people with mental disabilities. The first is what we call securing justice, and this is where we focus on conducting strategic litigation on core aspects to advance the human rights protections provided to people with mental disabilities. The second area that we work on is advocacy and public policy, and the third is our building solidarity work. This is where we do research and public communications work. For those of you that were here yesterday at the side event, my colleague Shara, who is sitting over here, Shara Pastor, our child rights project manager, led a program where we conducted monitoring in children's institutions in 4 EU member states, so the United Kingdom, Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, and in Hungary. I think even us as a human rights organisation were particularly shocked with some of the later findings that came out, which really did show that the forms of segregation that children with mental disabilities in Hungary are facing today are perhaps very similar to the situation that there was 10 years ago. Seeing children, as Georgette has also said, in straitjackets, seeing children tied to their beds and seeing them denied basic communication is quite a shocking experience in modern Europe. And perhaps more shocking for me was to know that this institution, which housed 220 children and adults with disabilities, was in receipt of European Union funding. So this was one of the first cases where we saw with our own eyes not just evidence of torture and ill treatment inside such institutions, but the fact that it had been directly funded by the European Union. Sorry, I'm trying to use this thing. Okay. And let's not forget that where we are now, whilst there has been some development in terms of deinstitutionalisation strategies in Central and Eastern Europe, we have to understand the long history in the region of segregation on the basis of disability. this approach, which obviously was in every country in evidence in Central and Eastern Europe, but also more broadly, and particularly before the fall of communism, really did not see persons with disabilities as holders of human rights. The dominant approach in the organisation of social systems was to see these people as either objects of care or objects that require management. Okay? So what we saw was the development of large-scale institutionalization in these regions, based on methods of control and coercion. And frequently in many institutions, and because of their institutional nature, we see extensive use of both physical, chemical, and multiple forms of restraint. And overwhelmingly, the approach in both social care institutions as well as in child psychiatric provision, where that existed, which was in not many countries, was an overwhelmingly biomedical approach. So an approach which diagnosed the child, an approach which sought to restrain the child, but very little about the child as a human rights holder. And particularly when we talk about children with mental disabilities, institutionalization would often occur very early in childhood. This is through early diagnostic processes that would be used in this region particularly, so-called defectology, or the science of defectology was prevalent right across the region, and children and parents, in fact, were often advised that it's best off for their child to be placed in an institution, because otherwise they would become a burden on the family, on the community as well. So, of course, in 2006, and from the perspective that I will touch on here, on the disability rights perspective, actually, we began to see a growing international move away from these old perspectives, these old approaches of isolating and segregating people with disabilities, to respecting them as holders of human rights. And much as the same way as the Convention on the Rights of the Child fundamentally changed our view of children as rights holders, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities achieves a similar objective. And it does this in a rather novel manner. In particular, it totally reformulates our understanding of disability, and this reformulation is critical because I think when we look at the definition of what disability here in the Convention is, the connection between impairments and attitudinal barriers in society, we start to see the potential for change. It is not merely about curing the child of their impairments, but it's actually about identifying the structural, attitudinal, and environmental barriers which restrict their ability to be included, okay, in the community. And building on that, the Convention for the first time gave us a very, very strong statement that discrimination on the basis of disability cannot be allowed in any case. And in fact, it violates the inherent dignity of persons with disabilities in itself. This now, today, may sound like a basic statement of human rights principles, but in fact, in this forum, we will be common with these ideas. We will be familiar with these ideas, but in fact, in Central and Eastern Europe, very rarely, when we talk with policymakers or decision makers, has this paradigm shift really filtered through in reality. And that is why we continue to see, I think, large rates of institutionalization of children with disabilities in Central and Eastern Europe. It's also important to point out that children with disabilities, when placed in such institutions, are not just denied their liberty. Of course, in many cases, they're also denied access to any education whatsoever. They're denied access to adequate health care in many scenarios. And very, very little habilitative or rehabilitative services are often in place for such children to eventually leave such institutions. And as has already been pointed out, it's clear on the evidence that a child who is placed in an institution, a child with a disability placed in an institution at a young age, is much more likely and continues to be far more likely to spend the rest of their lives in institutions. So let me skip ahead because I will run out of time. But we have looked at a number of angles. Around children with disabilities in institutions, and the first was a major initiative we looked at on access to justice, specifically for children with disabilities. Because whilst we welcome the steps various governments have made towards deinstitutionalisation, the reality is that in few countries is there an enforceable right to live in the community, and there are even less opportunities for children to enforce their right to community-based services. In 10 countries in the European Union, we found that children in institutions are particularly vulnerable due to the fact that they lack any independent support to exercise their rights, and in many cases they continue to lack any form of independent legal assistance. And most worryingly, perhaps, and when we think about the issue of deprivation of liberty, we also saw in a number of countries that children placed in institutions on the basis of disability were frequently placed there on the basis of social contracts, so contracts with parents or guardians, which in legal terms would remove them from the protections around deprivation of liberty legislation in the country. They would not be regarded as deprived of liberty. And in Hungary, most recently, where we complained about the death of one child in an institution, we were told, and we said there should be an investigation which met core minimum standards for persons deprived of their liberty. We were told explicitly that this was not a case of deprivation of liberty, and in fact, the vast majority of the population of children and adults with disabilities in the country were not deprived of their liberty, so the law did not apply. So there's an important access to justice barrier that remains here, and this report, which looks at the situation in 10 countries, is very, very useful for identifying specifically procedural accommodations that need to be provided to children with disabilities so that they can directly access the courts. The second programme I've already mentioned, which was about us developing a toolkit to monitor abuse and ill treatment against children with disabilities in institutions. But it's important also for me to point out that this toolkit also looks at disability-based forms of abuse and violence, which continues to occur in the institutions. And I really very much encourage you all to read this and use this as a way of putting pressure, particularly on ombudsmen's offices, to conduct more effective human rights monitoring in such locations. And thirdly, following up from the first project, really, we have identified that lawyers and judges very much lack access to knowledge and information on how to represent such child victims of human rights violations. And so we think it is extremely important, particularly at the European Union, that further efforts are placed on providing those skills and those forms of training to lawyers and judges in the field. So what are the big three or four issues that I would like to finish on and talk about, and that we continue to see in our work? It is still concerning today in the Czech Republic, for example, that we have institutions that you've already spoken about where children under the age of 3, on the basis of disability, are institutionalized. Now, that's not the only basis on which they are institutionalized. The other group that is overrepresented in these children's homes are children from the Roma community. So Roma children and children with disabilities at the age of 3 are found to have defects and are still placed in these institutions. In 2010, I think there was about 1,800 places in these institutions in the country. Today, there continues to be about 1,500. So we are not seeing progress, and if we cannot tackle institutionalization at the under 3 age, I think that we're going to have problems reforming the rest of the system as well. quickly, the phenomenon of trans-institutionalization. And this is actually a map of Bulgaria, which, as many of you probably will know, has been much lauded internationally for a very, very successful deinstitutionalization strategy for children, all children, including children with disabilities. However, it's becoming clear, and also from some of our monitoring, that instead of closing all of these institutions, the country has actually opened up 150 smaller institutional services, and we would call them institutions because in many respects they reflect exactly the same culture, norms, rules, etc. as the previous large institutions. In some cases we've seen large institutions closed down, and on the same grounds 5 or 6 small such group centres have been placed within the same grounds with the same children, with the same staff and with the same director. Financing, this is Andor is coming after us, but we now have, and particularly after the situation in Topaz, we have clear evidence of the misuse by many countries, in fact, but specifically in Hungary and in Bulgaria, of the misuse of European Union structural investment funding, which is being used to both maintain, renovate and build, and this is critical for people to understand, and build new institutions. This is in complete breach, of course, of the ex-ante conditionalities under European structural investment funds, and in the situation of Topaz Special Home, which I've already spoken about, we have evidence inside this institution of acts of ill treatment and torture. Now, I think that this is something that I'm quite keen to hear, Andor, about the response of the Commission on this. But what we are not yet seeing is any form of accountability for those who are responsible for this. I've already spoken about access to justice, but just to say, as an NGO in this field, we're taking, and we're going to be continuing to take some litigation on behalf of those children and young people so that they can get out of such institutions. Specifically in relation to Topaz, and what we would like to see is how the European Commission will provide support, particularly to the victims of very, very serious human rights violations, which in some cases you have also funded. So I'm not going to continue with this. I think I've run out of time, but perhaps I could hand over to you, Andor, to hear what the Commission's going to do.
Many thanks, Stephen. Many thanks also for the effort in wrapping up. I have to say your intervention touched upon many issues that are actually very close to my heart, if I can say it like that. The unit I represent not only works on children's rights, but also on integration of Roma communities, and most importantly, even because of the size of the issue, on rights of persons with disabilities. We are actually the focal point for the implementation of the convention at EU level. So the whole panoply of issues that you touch upon are extremely relevant for our work, and therefore very interesting for me particularly, if I can say. And I think that you made a perfect transition to our next speaker. I'm very glad to introduce to all of you my colleague Andor Urmos, who works in DG Regional and Urban Policy. He's a policy analyst responsible for the thematic coordination of the European Regional Development Fund, in particular for measures supporting the growth pillar of the European 2020 strategy, which includes a lot of topics that possibly Andor is going to tell us about. So Andor, the floor is yours for 15 minutes.
Now it works. Thank you very much. I think I have a very easy job today because, I mean, there was so much actually kind of introductions to this presentation, so I just have to kind of make some messages and that's it. So it will be hopefully much less than 15 minutes. So my job is today, as I see it, actually to respond, let's say, to these requests, what Steve, George, and some other colleagues actually raised. And of course, we are very happy actually to respond to your questions in the scope of the question and answer session. At the same time, I would like to highlight some of the, let's say, the new challenges, because what the colleagues, they said, this is absolutely relevant and absolutely important, but at the same time, as we see actually the implementation of the structural funds today, we are facing even new challenges. And I'm trying to highlight some of these new challenges and how we can or how we should respond to this. So I would start with this case because I think it's important that Steve was talking actually a little bit about the top house in the Hungarian case, which was like reported this May. And we were kind of faced actually by this another case, actually Romania, the Tantava disability home, which was also refurbished by the structural funds. And we got a very important message actually from the civil society and from journalists that people are tortured in this institution after the refurbishment, even after the refurbishment is the institution. So it means that actually, let's say, the physical shape of this building is very nice, but actually the treatment has not changed. So what to do? Our commissioner was interviewed actually by Al Jazeera several years ago, and he had to reply actually to this question, now what to do? Dear commissioner, what is your response actually to this problem as the institution was refurbished and people are tortured? The answer is not easy, and I'm going back to this question, why the answer is not so easy as we think that, let's say, let's immediately actually, I don't know, dismantle these institutions and let's immediately make some sanctions. Okay, let's come back to this question a bit later. But what I would like to highlight very, very briefly is this question actually about, let's say, the lack of focus on the institutionalization is not new. We learned it from the 2007-13 period when member states, they allocated actually the structural funds, that more money is going for institutionalization than for deinstitutionalization. That was very, very clear in the report that the shift to the community-based services, this is one of the most important challenge of the 2007-13 period. Why? Because probably, and it was probably a mistake from the Commission and from the member states together, like we have not discussed it as a specific objective. And that's very important actually to highlight today, and that could be a message for the future as well. We need to be as much as possible specific. Because, I mean, as soon as you're talking actually about kind of, providing the conditions for independent living and to make all of these general and vague terms, people, they don't understand it. The thing is that what you have to say is that we don't finance institutions, we don't refurbish the institutions, we provide social housing for people. That's clear, okay? So and this could be a very important message for the post-2020 discussions as well, as we launch the discussions with the new programming period, that let's be as much as possible specific and don't leave people in this kind of vague terms. The other very important issue, and just would like to highlight here as well, actually segregation in general. Segregation of Roma children, segregation in housing, and segregation of disabled people. This is also something what we have to be a bit more careful than before, because actually some investments have been made to kind of reinforce the segregation in many member states. Okay, so what's happening now? Understanding actually this kind of particular issues and understanding that we have to be as much as possible specific, we ask member states to be more concentrated, and we provided some so-called preconditions. That's what we call ex-ante conditionality for effectiveness. Probably we should not waste too much time on that because you know very well what are they, but just to be very clear. In this programming period, member states are invited to prepare strategies in every field where they are investing. So it means in health, in education, in transport, wherever they want to invest, we need to see the big picture. We need to see actually the framework of these investments. When it comes to the deinstitutionalization or the inclusion of disabled people, it should be included in the poverty reduction strategy. And that's what we actually discussed with member states in the recent years, that how you see actually the inclusion of disabled people today, how the deinstitutionalization should be included in the poverty reduction framework. The other important feature here of the 2014-20 period is the concentration. And I would like to highlight another important message here. The structural funds are for changes, for structural changes. We need to understand how the structural funds are contributing to the reforms. We should not see these investments as they are covering all the needs in the particular country. So when member states, they are highlighting that we have a need because some institutions are in a very bad shape, physical shape, and we need to improve actually the physical conditions of the institutions because people are freezing. That's what we are kind of hearing many times, and Steve was kind of also highlighting that. We understand that, but this is not about the concentration. The concentration is about how you invest in structural changes and how you concentrate the funds actually to make the changes. That's not easy, because the political priorities are always broader than just simply actually focusing on the reform. So for the next negotiations, that's also something what we have to understand, that how to be, again, more specific and how to concentrate more on deinstitutionalization and how to move away for investing in institutions as much as possible. These are the ex-ante conditionalities. These are the, let's say, the preconditions for the funding. Probably colleagues who are sitting in the room, they know it very well. Just I would like to highlight that there are two very important general ex-ante conditionality, which is the anti-discrimination and the disability, which should be applied across the investment everywhere. And it's also an important message for today. We should not just should talk about the social inclusion aspect of the institutions. The investments. There are other areas where actually these two ex-ante conditions should be applied. What is that? For example, energy efficiency, ICT, transport. Wherever you invest, you have to keep in mind that the UNCPRD should be applied. So in the provisions for independent living, it's not just for the social inclusion. It's everywhere, should be taken into account. When it comes to the anti-discrimination, of course, the Charter and Fundamental Rights should be applied everywhere. And I mentioned the poverty reduction strategy, which is a thematic ex-ante conditionality for member states, where there's a specific criterion saying depending on the identified needs, it should include actually measures for the shift from institution to community-based services. Okay, the UN Convention has been ratified by all member states, okay? And, of course, by the European Union. So it means that all of us who are sitting here, actually, we have a responsibility actually to implement the UNCPRD. That's very important to understand, because the link between the investments and the UNCPRD, that's something what we have to understand a bit better actually in the future. Because in the scope of the discussions with member states and with different stakeholders, actually, when you invest in an institution, let's say improving the physical conditions in the institutions, then people, they are questioning whether this is a breach of the UNCPRD or not. Okay? And we need to understand it a bit better, because what Steve is saying, it's the breach. What other people are saying, it's not a breach. Okay? So actually, we just launched some discussions internally in the Commission to understand it better, because we need even some kind of legal assessments here, because people are questioning that investments in institutions, this is, let's say, the breach of the UNCPRD. Okay? And these are, let's say, the most important articles for us from the UNCPRD and from the Charter of Fundamental Rights. One is actually about the provision of the independent living conditions, and the other one is about actually the non-discriminative treatment of people with disabilities. Okay, we are understanding all of these challenges. Actually, the thematic guidance for the 2014-20 period has been kind of established in a way to make it clear that investments in institutions should be very, very minimal. And even building or renovating long-stay residential institutions is excluded regardless of their size. George and Steve said just recently that it's not the reality. And this is true. So even if we promote actually this message, actually something is happening in the opposite end. Why? And that's an important question, actually. Why still member states, they are investing in institutions? Just to make you a very simple example, last year in Czech Republic, we just realized that actually the measures in the OP and the call for proposals, they are not, let's say, aligned. So it means that actually the call for proposals are going against the objectives of the operational program. So what happened, we asked the Czech authorities to suspend the call for proposal. That was the simple way, actually, to say that, look, I mean, this is not what we want. But again, the question is how you check all the call for proposals across the EU. We are talking about a couple of thousands of call for proposals, and I'm not talking about the projects, which are a couple of tens of thousands, right? So this is, again, something what we have to understand for the future, how to make it clear and how to make the preventive measures, actually, to avoid such situations, okay? So here we are talking about actually investing more in community-based services when it comes to the guidance, making mainstream services accessible, and high-quality individualized services should be part of the structural funds investments. So when it comes to the ERDF, and I would like to say something important for us to understand that we are facing in DG Regio with the ERDF a bit more kind of problems and scandals than colleagues in DG Employment. Why? Because we are investing in infrastructure, and infrastructure is visible. When it comes to the ESF investments, it's more about the trading, it's fine. But when it comes to the building and the equipment, I mean, we are in trouble because it will last for the next 20 years, right? So that's why we are always more in the spotlight, more in the media than colleagues in DG Employment. This is a fair treatment or not? I don't know. So but this is another question. No, let's not discuss that one. Right, okay. So, but we are trying to make it clear that the priority should be given to the shift to community-based services. At the same time, some investments are made to small group homes, as it was mentioned before, assisted housing and accessibility measures. Just recently, we introduced a new rule. It was like 2 months ago. No investment should be made in long-stay residential institutions when it comes to energy efficiency, ICT, and other areas. That is clear now. We made it clear for everybody because some investments are still ongoing in Hungary and in other countries in the scope of energy efficiency. So in a very practical terms, people are saying that we have to refurbish the heating system in the institutions because people are freezing. So please, let us use actually the ERDF actually for this kind of purposes. Now we said it clearly, no. And on 24th of November, we are going to have a meeting in Hungary, the so-called annual review meeting with all the managing authorities, where we have to discuss actually with the Hungarian authorities how we will kind of suspend the payments. Because that's not what we want, clearly. At the same time, again, probably the Hungarian authorities, they will come back to us that, look, but we have a huge problem actually here. So still we need to invest in institutions because people are facing difficulties. So that's the discussion what we are going to have. I'm really very looking forward to that. And just a few words, just a few words actually about the small group homes, because people are considering that this is, let's say, the way how we should invest in the institutionalization. Estonia has invested in the 2007-13 period actually in small group homes. So these are pictures actually of the small group homes. So you can see it very well probably that this is really not what we want. This kind of isolated small group homes in the middle of nowhere, probably that's not what we want, right? Yeah, but I mean, if you see actually these pictures, you would say, oh, these are beautiful buildings, beautiful furniture, so why you're questioning that? Yeah, because people, they still very much isolated, segregated from the mainstream services. So now actually, if you see the Estonian programs, they are saying that actually everything what you do should be in the city, or let's say within the boundaries of the locality, not outside of the locality. I think you may think that it's funny or it's stupid, but that's happening in the reality. Okay, and just a few words that, as Steve said and George said, I'm finishing very, very soon. So there are some other reports from other countries where actually this kind of, misuse of the funds, it's clear. Czech Republic, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, where you see actually that, for example, they are more focused on technical standards than on quality of life. Surveillance cameras are built for small group homes. Of course, the human rights violation reports from Romania and Hungary, they are quite clear. The toilet has been built in the middle of the hall. So there are plenty of problems. And if you see actually the small group homes rules, then you are even more kind of, I don't know what is the right word here, shocked, right? Because what's happening here, you have 10 minutes to make phone calls per day. You are not allowed to make decisions without the consent of your occupational therapist, and so on. So there are rules which are completely following the institutional character which was before. So what to do now? Probably we don't need small group homes in that way in the future. So we have to be actually a bit more careful actually with the small group homes. And there are some other issues which have to be taken into account when it comes to the, let's say, the challenges, still ongoing challenges in the 2014 programs. Let's say, for example, there is no needs assessment. Individual needs assessment is simply missing. When you ask member states, okay, have you made an individual needs assessment? Can you tell us that how many people still would need actually institutional treatment? There is no answer because they don't do it. Too much focus on the size of the investment, size of the institutions, and the link to the labor market integration is really very weak. And I'm finishing here. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Andor, for this presentation. It seems that the Commission services involved in the next multi-annual financial framework design and the next programming period of the funds have a lot of work ahead to get it right and to improve the current situation, in particular in making stronger linkages than today between policy directions, policy guidelines and initiatives, and the way in which the funds are used in order to support the policies that we want to implement. I have to thank very much all the speakers up to now, because they have been very disciplined and they have kept the time, which means that we still have kind of 10 to 12 minutes in front of us to open a little bit of a discussion. But before doing that, I would like to ask Jana whether she wants to shortly react to anything of what has been said up to now.
So I don't want to take up precious time for conversation. Just also, we will be focusing in after the break on the more practice-oriented presentation. So we're going to break at 20 past and then have 20 minutes break. And then we'll have the 2 practice presentations and Danius. So I think this opportunity here is for us to a little bit exchange what we've heard now this morning, looking at the EU framework. And Andor said we are in a period of next negotiations. So we are looking to a new financial framework beyond 2019, which is a really critical opportunity for us to reflect on what has worked and what has not worked. And I think we've heard a number of examples this morning about how we need to do things better. This issue of trans-institutionalization, it would be very interesting to hear if anybody in the room has similar experiences. This is the idea of closing institutions is about putting those people in those institutions in smaller settings and using the money to build those kinds of infrastructures without any shift in terms of mentality, culture, the whole rights-based approach that we're here to advocate for. Accountability. How do we hold those people account? We can take pictures. We have pictures of saying, this is funded by the EU. What happens? Is it right that you then suspend calls for proposals or those projects? It's a very complex procedure. As you said, Andor, you have tens of thousands of projects, but many calls for proposals. How are we keeping track of that? Yep. And I think for us, what is absolutely crucial is the role of civil society here as well. How do we engage with governments and hold governments to account? And right now, the system is not functioning. We have monitoring committees where governments can select the people they know will agree with what they are saying, and they do not have any means through which to get criticism. So how are we getting this, and then if there is criticism, how do we use that to influence the process? What is absolutely key, and I really want to thank Pavel for being here, this personal testimony, how are we actually enabling people in these services to have their voices heard? Now, clearly, the strategic litigation of MDAC is absolutely crucial in this cultural shift, but we can't wait till all those processes go through and there are people suffering, and how do we make sure that those voices are being heard in the reforms and the planning and the implementation? Because that's ultimately what a rights-based approach means, is about the people who these care services are supposed to serve are actually, their voices and their needs are being met. So I think the floor is open for you. We have 10 minutes. Please, or just one other thing. We've heard a lot about Central and Eastern Europe. This is not only about Central and Eastern Europe. And I'm looking around the room. There are many people from France, from Portugal, from Greece, the system might be quite different. You might not kind of associate yourself with some of the pictures that we had of the caged beds, but there's still an institutionalized culture. And the EU structural funds, if you talk to any managing authority in Spain, in Austria, and Belgium, where we're working on the Opening Doors campaign, they have absolutely no clue that EU structural funds, social fund and ERDF can be used for investing in children, for reforming child protection and welfare systems. And that's what we want to change in the next round as well. So now I'll stop.
Please.
Hello, thank you for this very interesting focus and of this subgroup. I'm Adriana Ciampa from Italian Ministry of Labour and Social Affairs, and I think that this could be the occasion to share our approach to this issue. Now we have passing from the deinstitutionalization to the prevention to institutionalization. In Italy, we have no institutionalization from the end of 2006. For law is forbidden. We have foster care and family-based community. So children that have to put out from their families of origin could go or in foster care or in family-based communities. But this is not the point. For us, the point now is another. The question is, we have to reduce the out-of-family placement, or we have to make a choice in order of the better intervention for this family and for that family and that minor. Pavel this morning said a very interesting thing. That is our point of starting. They don't solve my mother's problems. They bring children in institution. Our politics, our policy now is to make in order to prevent the out-of-family placement. How? We know that in the more than 30% of cases of rape, yes, of cases of out-of-placement, of placement of out-of-family, the cause was economical. So with a very intensive intervention in the family, with a very defined in the time intervention, with house intervention, so the social services goes to the family and not the family to the social services, with a very strong system of evaluation, with a very coordinating multidisciplinary equipe, and a very strong governance, local governance. Now we have an experimentation in all over the Italian territory, with more than 1,000 families and minors, and from the beginning to the PP program. I don't know if someone knows this kind of program, but we shared already this program with the European Commission. From the beginning of PP program with the family inside PP program, we have no separation of children by their family. So for other information, we have all on the website of Ministry of Labour and Social Affairs.
Thank you very much. That's a very interesting approach, very interesting experience, and we are sure that there are many others in the room that can be shared, but please, I remind you and I really urge you not to make statements, but to try to put questions, because we have very little time and we need to make good use of it. By the way, when you ask your question, if it's addressed to a specific member of the panel, please let us know. There was a question down there. Yes.
Thank you. My name is George Nikolaidis. I represent here the Institute of Child Health Greece, and we also work with Lumos in the project for the institutionalization of Greece, especially in the worst institution for children with disabilities in Greece, in Lechena, Western Greece, an institution that's been notorious in gaining bad publicity for Greece. And I'm shocked to tell you that this morning I was informed that one of the 48 residents passed away last night due to the poor conditions, despite the work that we have been doing to the last 2 years. And my question is very specific to the representatives of the European Commission, because the situation, as Jana has described it just now, is perfectly matching what is the situation for Greece. There's widespread misuse of funds, of structural funds of use in the previous periods. I have seen residential care facilities which have renamed 2 yards of their institution as shelter for independent living with the financial support of the European Commission, and the next 2 yards is shelter for independent living number 2, and the 2 next is shelter for independent living number 3. Okay, and we have also laid plans with Lumos, and we have presented to DG Regio, structural unit for Cyprus and Greece, and the DG Employment for reforming this particular horrible institution in Lechena, and also presented them to the government. And then so far nothing happens. And it seems to me, and I'm sorry that I'm frustrated and angry, but the only DI plan that the real owners of the place have is that gradually, as time goes by, the residents will pass away one after the other, and then the institution will be closed. So what are the specific mechanisms and steps that we need to take in order to improve transparency to all levels of stakeholders and bind all stakeholders that they will be committed to a specific direction which will be accountable in all steps? Because that's my question, and I leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I fully understand your frustration, and I can even share it. I will take two more questions, and then I will pass the floor to the panel for answers. Who wants to intervene? We have these 2 questions. You can start, and then I will go to the back.
Well, it's a bit similar. Sorry. Again, or did everybody? I'm Maartje Berger from the Netherlands, Defense for Children in the Netherlands. And the issue in the Netherlands is that the number of children in closed youth care facilities is going up. It was on the news yesterday, and everybody is quite frustrated about it. And there's another thing what happens in the closed institutions. They use a lot of force, isolation cells, but somehow they register it, but they don't monitor it. So they don't have to tell the inspection how often a kid is in isolation or how often the use of force is being used. And the ministry is not really interested. I've been asking for numbers, but somehow the ministry doesn't have them. So I'm always surprised, like, why wouldn't, if you work for the government, why wouldn't you want to know what's happening in the institutions? So that's the issue, and it's sort of difficult to get statistics, although they are there.
Thank you very much. Yeah, in the back, thank you.
Now it's on. Yeah, thank you. My name is Heike Kuhn. I'm from the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development in Germany, and I have a short question to the panelists. I just would, if I got it right, I understood that Bulgaria was in a role model as they will have the next EU presidency. Do you think that there will be, steps forward in the right direction, and could maybe you also push them a little bit, just to understand? Thank you.
Many thanks. So we are back to the panel. I think under the Greek question goes to you.
For sure. Right. I think we know, I mean, through George and with some other course, we know very well actually the Greek, let's say, history. Just for the colleagues, we have made several attempts actually to talk to the Greek government in the scope of bilateral discussions, seminars, and everything. Because the point is that there is no clear kind of policy line or strategy in Greece which would say that actually we are going in this direction. No, nothing. In that way, we should not invest in this field, because I mean, if we don't know what we are doing, then because it's all about actually this, the conditionalities and effectiveness, and so we have to understand what the Greek authorities they want to do today and in the future, and that's why George knows much better than me actually that Lumos initiated actually discussion with the government actually to kind of prepare a DI strategy in Greece, but we have not received any kind of response from the Greek government. Without the active participation of the Greek government, it's very difficult to say that, okay, we can impose something to do in Greece. So from the structural funds point of view, we need a cooperation. If the government doesn't want to cooperate, then they have a right not to cooperate with us. They have a right. Okay, the other question here is that actually they have ratified the UNCPR, they have ratified other, let's say, legal requirements, so it means that they have to follow. So it means that actually what are the other instruments to be used actually to make a kind of push on the Greek government, because the funds, again, it should be based on the bilateral cooperation. Thank you.
Thanks, Andor. On the question on the Bulgarian presidency, very briefly, as you may know, there are council conclusions that are being prepared on deinstitutionalization to be adopted still under Estonian presidency. They are going to be in the agenda of the next EPSCO meeting, which, if I am not mistaken, is taking place 7th of December. So that's going to set the framework for the institutionalization for the future, for the foreseeable future. And of course, this will bind Bulgarians as they will bind any other member state in this sense. But it is true that usually the fact of holding the presidency kind of morally obliges you to become a good pupil if you were not, at least for the time you are holding the presidency. So I would hope that this can have a positive effect in the situation on the institutionalization or institutionalization in Bulgaria. But what I would hope most is that the fact that we adopt council conclusions on this topic has a push effect for all the member states and not only those holding the presidency. On the question on the statistics and situation of involvement of national governments, who wants to? Okay, Georgette, please.
This is so common, it's unbelievable. And it happens for a number of reasons. But I think that the bigger structural reasons behind this are to do with what Renata Winter was talking about earlier today. And this is why the global study on children deprived of liberty is so important. And I think that sometimes in Europe, we can kind of think, well, these UN things and these global study things, that's really about developing countries, that's about the poorer countries and so on. Actually, we really, if in European countries that are very, very well established, very wealthy, have got relatively stable governments, if we can't count how many children we're locking up and abusing and what have you, how on earth can we expect Haiti or, Nepal or countries like that to do it? And so it's actually our responsibility to really push for this global study on children deprived of liberty. So one of the things I would say from this is if there's anyone here who's a representative of a European government that is not either Austria or Switzerland, please can you find a way to push your government to actually give some money towards the global study. And then the other thing that we should send from this meeting as well is a very, very strong message to the European Commission. The European Commission needs to find a way to help fund this study. If the European Commission would put £500,000, which we know in terms, and I understand the complexities behind how do you find it, which budget line, where does it go from, and so on. Yeah, it shouldn't be complicated. But if you could find £500,000 this year to put into this, we know private sector organisations that will put some money in as well. We can help Manfred to reaches million by the end of the year, and then this global study will happen, then it becomes a tool and a lever for all of us. Anyone who was around and involved with the study on violence against children, as I was 12 years ago, it's almost unimaginable the impact that has had on global programming around the world. And I do believe that this is, children deprived of liberty, children who are locked up, children who are hidden away. This is, if you like, the last vestige in many respects. These are the kids that nobody wants to talk about, that everyone wants to pretend are not there. And the more that we develop child protection systems and the more we improve child protection around the world, those are the children who become more and more and more vulnerable and more forgotten about. So they are essential. Very briefly on the statistics side of things, quite often that there are a number of reasons why statistics are not counted well. It's about who's got the responsibility for it. This is something that, in my experience, ombudsmen's or ombudspeople's offices can actually be really helpful with. And so I think that's somewhere to look. Is there a way of getting your ombudsperson to take this on as an issue? Because then one of the reasons quite often is because 17 different departments have actually got the stats for different reasons, and no one's really counting. So that is one of the things that I think that you can use. But I also think the global study itself is going to be a way that's going to help us to push governments to start collecting the right data and collecting the right statistics and actually having to report what they're doing to these kids behind the walls.
Many thanks.
Can I add
30 seconds.
just a little bit? But Defence for Children is undertaking now a study about what's happening in those institutions. But the thing that bothers me is that we can ask the ombudsman, we can do it ourselves. But as someone working for the government, you have to know what's going on to change the policy. And they're really into best practices and changing the policy and best interests of the child. But if you don't know what's going on, you don't have to change it. So that's the problem. But thank you.
Thanks for that. Indeed, I mean, in order to put reasonable policies in place, you need to be well informed about what the facts are in the first place. Thanks to all. Thanks to the panelists for their presentations. Thanks to those that intervened from the floor. We are now going to break for 20 minutes. It is basically past. So we are going to resume at 10:02 sharp. Enjoy the coffee break. Hello, hi again, welcome back. I hope you all enjoyed the coffee, even though Commission coffee is not well known for its quality. And thanks for the discipline in coming back on time. So it's now 10 to 12, and we are going to give directly the floor to our next speaker, who is Wen Verminden. She is a member of the board of MyAssist, and MyAssist is the state-funded NGO recognized by the Flemish Agency for Disabled Persons, which is in charge for personalized financial support to disabled people. And she's going to explain us how in Flanders there is a new personalized budget scheme that supports families with disabled children to make sure that they can remain living at home and attend normal schooling in their communities. So Wen, thanks for being here, and the floor is you for 15 minutes.
So hello everybody. I saw that my PowerPoint is not the most recent version, so there might be some Dutch word in it, like bijstandsorganisatie. It's like the organization MyAssist who helps people in using the personal assistance budget for children with a disability. But the most important question is, where does that budget come from? So it's, the Flemish government, because we are a small country, but we have 3 different kinds of government, so that's important to know. They finances an agency that provides budgets and resources for people with disabilities, as long as they have been diagnosed as having a disability before their 65th birthday, and they live in Flanders. So if you are 70, for example, and you are diagnosed, that doesn't count. They have 2 subcategories in their help, and that's assistive devices, for example, for communication or mobility that can give the people the opportunity to stay at home because the parents can take good care of their kids like that. And there is the budget for personal assistance. And their goal is to promote the autonomy and quality of life of people with disabilities in all areas. So we have 2 different kinds of budgets. We have the PVB, it's the person's following budget. It's mainly for adults with disabilities. It's the new system. So the point is to get all the budgets, also for the children in the next 4 years, all to this kind of budget. That means that the government will no longer finance the institutions themselves, but will give the persons with a disability a backpack with the money, and they can choose how they are going to organize their care, their needs, and they can buy, they can pay a personal assistant to stay at home. But because it's for children, this forum, I will talk about PAB. It's the personal assistance budget. So that gives the children the chance to stay at home with a personal assistant. So that's why it's in red, because it's for adults, but we are not going to talk about it. Depending on the degree of care, an assessment is made of the need for care, and a budget is based on this result. So it's normal that not every child will get the same budget. I think that's quite normal. The actual budget allocated depends on the severity of the illness and the extent of support granted. And an annual budget will be allocated accordingly. So there are different kind of things that they will take in consideration, like is there possibility for communication or not? Can she be transported or not? Can she be nutritioned or not? So that's all things that are taken in consideration. So that's the budget sizes. So it's an annual budget. They receive it every year. If they don't all use it, they will get the same amount of money the next year. So the lowest, the minimum budget is 9,788 and so on. And the most, the maximum budget is 45,000 euros. So with that budget, they can buy what can they buy or paid So personal assistant, so really someone who is in the house all the time to help them with the daily activities. It's also possible to buy service checks, so the parents can pay with a check someone to come and cook for them, to do the laundry, to wash, so they have more time to spend with their child and not with the other things that need to be done in the house. And it's also possible for residential care. So you can buy yourself into an institution. I know that's not what this is about, but instead, in case of an emergency or a crisis, if mom is sick or his dad broke his leg or I don't know, something like that, it's possible for them to go there for a short amount of time. So it stays possible for the parents to look after the child, and after some time the child can come back, and it's possible again for the parents to look after the child, which is very important. It's only possible to use the budget for things like that, so no material things. So assistive devices, it's not possible, and sometimes it's hard for people to understand because it's all from the same Flemish agency, so it's not always so simple for people. Adaptations at their house, at their home, it's the same thing. At the car, for example, or nursing, psychotherapy, it's all things that are paid for by another agency, so it's not always simple for the people to know what to buy and what not. So that's why we are a bijstandsorganisatie, so a support organization. So we are founded by the Flemish government, the Flemish Agency for People with Disability, for assistance with starting up and managing people's personal assistant budget, and also organizing their support. So they can contact us, and then we can help them with some of the things that are written. So how to choose the right support, because people get a budget, that's all fine, but what are all the possibilities they can do with it and what is not possible? How will they conclude a contract, because you really have to be an employer, so you really have to be the boss of someone who will take care of your child. How to negotiate with health care providers, because it's very important to know what you can buy with the money and what they will give you for that money. How to use it without needing to personally keep financial records, so totally always do your own administration. How to take up the role of employer, because it's sometimes something new for all the parents with children with disability. And how to account for the VAPH, because they find it, of course, very interesting to know what you are all doing with that money. We have a little case study to show how the budget and support organization can help. So we have an 11-year-old girl who have the meconium aspiration syndrome, and she has a multiple disability. So she has motor congestion combined with severe cognitive problems. So she has a severe need of care. An institution is not an option for her parents because they want to keep her home. But home is not an option either because the parents want to go to work. They have other children also who are perfectly healthy, so that they need attention also. Also, they can go to school. In Belgium, there are schools for with special education needs, but it's not possible for a teacher with 8 children in her class to give attention to all of the 8 children all the time, and it's very necessary for her. So that's why the Flemish Agency for People with a Disability granted her with a maximum budget of 45,000 euros a year. It was difficult for the parents because both parents had a difficult, a busy job. So they came to my assist to know, okay, what exactly can I do with this budget? Because it's a big amount of money, but what can I do and how can I provide the best care for my child so that she can come home after every day at school and she can be part of our family? So we helped her. Together we started to search for an assistant and an adapted school because that's 2 of the main important things. And thanks to the assistant, the girl can enjoy her school time and her free time because it's really the job of the assistants to help her with like everything. So in school there is guidance during the bus ride, because there is a bus who comes from the school to pick up all the children, but for her it's not possible to be there on her own, because it's dangerous sometimes, because she's in a wheelchair who is very sophisticated. She cannot eat normally, so she has a stomach pump. During lunch break, it's very important for her to be assisted to give her the food through her stomach pump. During class also, because she can be there, but she needs all the attention she can get, and it's not easy for the school teacher to give her all the attention she needs. At home, helping her get dressed, playing games, assistance in general for like everything she needs at that moment. So the assistant is there when her parents are there also, but because she's helped with all the things that are needed, it's easier for the parents to be with her, to let her stay home. Also her free time, assistance during playtime, youth group, going for a walk, trips to the zoo, so it's all possible for her. So what is the conclusion of this budget? The girl is well assisted and cared for, and she can go to school. So she doesn't have to go to an institution 7 days a week. Her parents know she's in good hands, and they can continue their work, which is very important for them too. The teacher is supported, so she can also give attention to the other kids in her class. And because of the assistance, it's possible for the girl to stay at home with her parents, and that is the main thing of this day, I think. So that's why it's such a good budget. So if you want to know more, this is our website. We are vested in Leuven. Voila. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wen, for your presentation, which clearly, as Jana mentioned before, has moved us from the more, theoretical policy type of interventions to the more practical intervention, and that was really practical. So what can we do in order to improve the day-to-day life of persons that need this type of support? And we are going to continue in this more practical note with the following two presentations. We have now two Scottish speakers, Marion MacLeod and Alison Goff. Marion works in Children in Scotland, which is an NGO lobbying for the interests of all children, but in particular when it comes to equal opportunities and access to support. And Alison works in the Center for Youth and Criminal Justice, which is an organization that supports those who work with children and young people that are offenders or at risk of becoming offenders. So Marion and Alison are going to have 25 minutes to share for their presentations. Thank you very much for being here as well.
Oh, thank you very much for inviting us. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Right, so the second question is, can everyone understand me? Because I have quite a strong accent and you have no translation, and I have to talk fast, so I'm afraid you're just going to have to bear with me. So first of all, I would like to thank the European Commission for two reasons. One is to allow, because they've allowed me to come here and talk about the Alternative Future project, in which I've been involved for nearly 2 years now. But secondly, for providing the funding for the project under the Rights, Equalities and Citizenship programme. This project is about to conclude. We have partners in 6 European countries which are listed there. I am not making any political statement whatsoever. The Catalans wish to be designated in that way, and it is their request, not mine. Scotland is at my request, so you can draw any conclusions you like from that. The partners include a variety of organisations, some children's organisations, but also agencies who work with gender issues and violence reduction issues. And it was very much the project was very much focused on violence reduction, the rights of children, issues of gender, and the experience of young people who had experience of the care system in relation to violence of different types. This didn't start out for us as an intention to look at secure care. As it happened, we did our fieldwork in Scotland with young people who were in one of the secure establishments in Scotland. And it was really looking at not their own personal experiences, but their perceptions of violence. And we also interviewed staff to get some sense of how well they were trained to deal with not defusing violent situations, though that was possibly some of it, but how they were enabled and supported to deal with the issues of the experience of violence that a lot of the young people had. I should probably say that residential care in Scotland is probably a bit different from some of the kind of pictures you've been seeing. We have, most of our young people in the care system are in foster care placements, but the vast majority, and certainly we have no young children in residential care. And our units are by and large fairly small. You know, we have few that have more than eight young people, and they tend to be located in the community. What is the same is the kind of experiences that bring them into these kind of settings. So we carried out interviews with young people. I'm not claiming this is a scientifically representative sample. It was 100% of the young people who were resident in the unit at that time, but it is not representative and was not intended to be a stratified sample that represented the residential care population, or indeed what the secure population might have been like the following month or the previous year. You cannot be locked up in Scotland indefinitely. You can only be locked up initially for 6 weeks, and that has to be reviewed, and then it can be extended in 3-month blocks thereafter. But we only really have one criterion for being locked up, and that is you are at risk to yourself or to somebody else. So it's not about whether you've committed an offence or anything else. So again, our criteria are a bit different, so our population probably is a bit different from some of our European neighbours. And we certainly found this in conduct of the project. The experience with our different partners and the population they were working with was fundamentally quite different. So the key themes that emerge, and this is where we stop being different and start being very much like everyone else. Early adversity, disordered attachments, disruption and unstable relationships, experience of violence, and this was experience of violence of every conceivable type. We interviewed one young woman. We had, I think, 19 different scenarios to which we were asking young people to react, from being, shouted at by a teacher for failing to do your homework, to being slapped on the face by a parent for staying out all night, to some lyrics of popular music, TV clips. We had one young woman who had experienced all but 2 forms of violence, and most of them had significant personal experience of most of them as victims, witnesses, but also in some cases as perpetrators. And I think you've got to be clear that these things are not separate. Young people who've experienced violence also are likely to become violent themselves. So if they don't receive the right support, you are increasing the risk of that. The life experiences of the young people indicated a high risk of poor emotional well-being and mental ill health. Most of them were not young people who were at risk to others. They were mostly young people who were at risk to themselves. And I think this is really important if we are looking strategically at why we are detaining young people. And I'll come to some of the kind of conclusions later. In contrast to some of the other experiences, we were hugely impressed with the dedication, commitment, and indeed professionalism of some of of all the staff we interviewed. But what was clear was that there was no systematic approach to enabling them to give the best possible support, or indeed the specialised therapeutic interventions that some of the young people really, really needed. All the young people we spoke to had severe, enduring and complex difficulties. They needed access to a range of highly skilled and appropriate interventions, which were often not readily available. Sometimes, for example, mental health support is provided not by the local authority, but by the health service, and there could be very long waiting lists and difficulties in accessing that service. So if somebody was on an order for 6 weeks, it might be months and months and months before they were actually even assessed by somebody from mental health services, never mind receiving support. What I think the conclusion we reached was similar to what others have said. The detention of young people seemed to be, in many cases, the only option of keeping them safe from the perspective of those delivering the services, not from the perspective of the young people themselves. And yes, it seems to be missing out some slides. Yeah. Yeah, sorry. Yes, I think another point that I would really want to make is that these kind of facilities are not cheap. They are very costly and it's public money. What we found is that many of the young people had had interventions at some significant public cost in their lives, which had actually made things a lot worse. Whatever problems they had had in their families had been compounded by multiple moves of placement. And as I said, you know, some young people had been placed for a 6-month period. They had just begun to settle, form relationships with staff when the secure order ended and they moved on. And some young people said, I can't cope outside here. I do something to get back in here the day I leave, which clearly has very, very difficult implications for their future adult life when, sadly, a lot of them do end up in prisons and other institutional settings because they have not been able to cope outside that kind of establishment. So quickly, how can we do things better? Yeah, avoid the problem for possible. Georgette has mentioned this, our Italian colleagues mentioned this. We need to, including addressing the financial stresses on families that generate ineffective parenting, we need to provide support to avoid problems. If you had a leak in your plumbing, you wouldn't leave it till it became a flood that kind of, had your ceiling coming down before you called a plumber. So if we wouldn't do it to our plumbing, I don't think we should be doing it to our children. Acknowledge what families say themselves is a problem. Laura Lundy talked about participation and voice. Absolutely. Very often, the problem that's being addressed is the ones professionals define, not the ones the families actually define themselves. And positive change is far more likely when people feel they are being listened to, responded to and respected. Absolutely, one of the key things to me is about the workforce. I think we can change buildings, we can, make the decoration more attractive, but the people working there do not have the fundamental concept of child rights, prevention, support, establishing stable and consistent relationship with them, then change is not going to happen. It is important that people in the workforce are skilled and to the appropriate level with the appropriate content of professional development to do their job well. We need a care system that's contributing to better outcomes. We should never have young people faced with the probability of having worse outcomes when they are finished with the care system than they did before they went in the first place. So, I think it is of real concern that we are spending, in sometimes many hundreds of thousands of euros of public money to make things a lot worse, and also in ways that actually mean we spend more and more and more money as these young people move on to adulthood and become parents themselves. So, finally, they're not troublesome young people, they are troubled young people. We need services that specifically address the needs, risks and vulnerabilities of young people who have a traumatic life experience. We should never, and I think this point has been made by several speakers and many times before, we should never be depriving them of liberty to make them more easy for us to manage. That's our problem, it's not theirs, and we shouldn't actually forget this. So I hope you managed to understand me despite me talking very fast. Thank you very much for listening. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thanks very much for this opportunity for speaking with you, and I'm going to pick up on some of the issues that Marian's covered in her presentation. I'm Alison Goff, and I'm working as Secure Care National Advisor based at CYCJ, which is the Centre for Youth and Criminal Justice, based at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. So we're funded mainly by the Scottish Government, but it's important to point out that we are independent of Scottish Government because we're based within an academic institution at the university. So I'm going to say just a very little bit about CYCJ and what we do, and then I'm going to talk about a specific area of work that we've been involved in, which is an independent review of secure care in Scotland, which was commissioned by the Scottish Government, really to explore many of the issues that Marian and others throughout the 2 days have already touched on in terms of how do we make that transition from use of detention to keep people safe within a care setting to other ways of approaching trauma recovery and trauma response and responding to risks and vulnerability. So I'm going to focus my presentation really on agency and participation. I'm going to ask the colleague if you wouldn't mind moving the slides on for me, because I'm panicking now when I saw the difficulties that Marian had. So we could move on to the next slide. The Centre for Youth and Criminal Justice, we're based at a university, but we're involved across practice, policy and research around youth justice and children and young people who are troubled and in difficulty and maybe in and on the edges of offending and in and on the edges of the formal care system and the justice and care system within Scotland. So that involves us in practice development, working with local authorities, working with social workers, working with a range of agencies out and about in the community and in different areas of Scotland. It also involves us in undertaking research and also learning and sharing from research, both within Scotland, the UK and internationally, and we're involved in knowledge exchange around that. We can move on to the next slide, please. So the Scottish Government had commissioned the Secure Care National Project to undertake this independent review of secure care in Scotland. And it's really all within the Getting It Right for Every Child policy framework, which has been implemented by the Scottish Government really across social care, healthcare, approaches to early years, education, and throughout the care system. And this really is a holistic approach to attempting to do what it says on the tin, to get it right for every child, with the Scottish Government's vision being that Scotland will become the best place in the world for children to grow up. So it's based around a well-being reel, which you can see in the centre of the slide there, looking at different aspects and different dimensions of a child's development and needs, vulnerabilities and developing capacity. And it's linked into the Curriculum for Excellence, which is our education curriculum. So there's strong linkage there between education and care systems. Within, if we can move on to the next slide. Within Scotland, secure care is defined as it's defined and regulated as a resource for keeping safe and meeting the needs of the most vulnerable young people who, as Marian explained, meet certain criteria where there are very, very high risks of significant harm and legal tests that have to be met. So there are very, very robust and rights-based approaches to how young people find themselves arriving in secure care. And Marian had talked about some of the kind of information around young people involved in offending and young people where the risks and vulnerabilities relate perhaps to their own mental health difficulties, perhaps to the impact of trauma, neglect, abuse, chronic childhood adversity. But what we found in CYCJ, and increasingly in Scotland, there's growing awareness and a growing evidence base of the links between adverse childhood experiences. So young people who become involved in serious and violent offending are nearly always children who have experienced multiple adverse childhood experiences. That's not to say that children who've experienced multiple adverse experiences will all go on to be involved in offending or involved in serious offending. Adversity is a predictor It is not a correlation. And I think it's important. So we're talking about the same children. When we talk, the children that will be discussed in the workshop along the corridor, in terms of young people in conflict with the law, we are talking about the same children. But within Scotland, we pride ourselves on having a welfare-based children's hearing system to deal with situations for all troubled children, whether those troubles surround concerns about children's the protection of children themselves or in relation to their behaviours in terms of offending towards others. And at the moment, within the 5 secure care centres that we have in Scotland, we have 84 placements. Within that, 90% of the children who are in secure care in Scotland are there on care and protection grounds through the children's hearing system. So interestingly, although Scotland really prides itself on having this holistic, welfare-based approach and on the work that we've been undertaking in the last 2 decades, really, towards the Getting It Right for Every Child framework, where the focus is all on early intervention and shifting the balance of care and support towards families, children, early years, supporting families within their own communities, and wherever possible, if children have to come into care, supporting them in family placements rather than in residential care. Despite all of that, we still have a situation where last week in Scotland, we had a handful of 16 to 18-year-olds who were in secure care on offence grounds. They were remanded or sentenced through the courts. And we had 43 children aged 16 to 18 in prison in our young offenders institution. So we still have a long way to go, and I think it's important that we acknowledge that. Moving on to the next slide, and I'll speed up now. So the context for the Secure Care national project was really trying to explore some of these tensions around the purpose and place of secure care within the Scottish care system. It is a care, these are care sittings, they are not young offenders institutions. There's been limited research into the impact and experience of secure care also as a form of care. So we were commissioned to undertake this independent review. And the way we decided to do that was to run the review in the way that we work as a centre. So the focus is on practice, it's on policy, and it's on research. And we wanted to keep young people and young people's voices and young people's experiences at the heart of that. So we undertook a year-long intensive programme of stakeholder engagement and consultation, and absolutely at the heart of that was hearing from 60 care experienced young people, the vast majority of whom were children who were in secure care at the time. And the recommendations that we put forward to the Scottish Government, which they have listened to, and in response they have established a strategic board to really transform what's happening within secure care and to further look at alternatives to secure care. Those recommendations were based on the calls for action raised by the 60 young people that we heard from. So there have been significant improvements in secure care, and this is what the project found in the last decade. And it's not just about the physical environment, it is about the range of facilities, for self-expression. It's about the quality of education, which has to be fully compliant with the mainstream curriculum, so children have real opportunities. The provision of specialist therapeutic and psychological interventions, and a well-being and outcomes-focused approach. But young people, statutory agencies and many other stakeholders also told us there are significant areas for further progress, not just in terms of looking at alternatives for secure care, but for that very small number of very vulnerable young people, how we're actually meeting their needs within secure care. And importantly, the board that's been established to take the young people's calls for actions forward, which met for the first time this month, there are 2 care experienced full board members within that board, and I think that's very important. So really, just quickly running through what young people told us about secure care and told us about their experiences that led up to a placement in secure care. There were very, very mixed views. Young people in secure care are not a homogenous group, and they didn't have a collective view on whether it is right in terms of protection of rights to actually be caring for young people who have committed serious offences of violence towards others, alongside those who may be extremely vulnerable to further abuse and harm. So you can see from some of the quotes of the young people that young people themselves are perplexed about the balance of rights and the issues within that in terms of protection. In terms of promotion of well-being and access to services, I think in terms of alternatives to secure care, there were some very, very strong messages for young people here. Young adults who were reflecting back, who had previous experience of secure care, wanted decision makers to hear that there should be more consistent, compassionate and psychologically continuity of care on offer throughout the care system, and that should be addressing all of children's needs and helping them make sense of the hurts that they've experienced. They talked about the need for close support and more intensive care and support to foster families to help children, and that should be available to all children across every area of Scotland, so that secure care was only ever used for those children where there was absolutely no alternative to keep them safe. And they said, importantly, that professionals are too often focused on the impact of children's behaviours and actions and not enough on the underlying reasons or drivers for those behaviours, which are difficult for others to live with or pose risks of harm. They described a lack of early identification of problems that meant that trauma and early abusive experience they had lived through had been invisible and went untreated. And as a consequence, when this trauma became apparent during adolescence, the focus was on the young person as a problem, the young person's challenging and risk-taking behaviour, not on the underlying need of the young person. If we can move on to the next slide. I know I've got very little time, but I wanted to talk specifically about some of the impact on rights within our secure care services and what we're hoping to be able to do to address these. The impact of admission and arriving in a place in a secure care facility, no matter how compassionate and caring the receiving staff were in that centre, was described as having a very, very heavy impact. And we were really quite shocked at the number of children and young people who had not had their rights explained to them. And for some young people, they had not even been told that they were going to be placed in a secure unit. So, for example, one young person was told he was going on a day trip, whereas in fact he was going to be transported to a secure unit. If we can move on, yeah, thank you. And in terms of day-to-day living in that restrictive environment, young people, these are the calls for action which were collated across the focus conversations we had with young people. So the calls for action that the board will be exploring is the mix and age range of young people within these secure care centres, and how that can be managed in a way that ensures that the living environment and the activity programme is appropriate for all children who are within the secure unit. Young people were telling us that the education opportunities, they were positive about the education opportunities that they had, but for some of them there was not enough therapeutic input from within the centre, and also from within CALM services and other mental health specialist supports that could come in. One of the things that struck us most strongly was the sense of fairness and agency, and how involved or not young people were in having any sense of self-determination. Because being locked in a secure care centre doesn't mean that young people should be losing all their rights, their freedom of expression, the use of young people being sent to their bedrooms for time out, for example, which is actually single separation when you're in a locked facility. All of these issues played themselves out, and a majority of young people talk to us about culture and the importance and the difference of culture within the centres. So there was clear variation in terms of how empowered young people felt, and how the disempowerment of being locked in a secure care centre, the level to which that was actually acknowledged and recognised on an ongoing and daily basis. And if we just will, yes. so if we can just move on, I'll move on to the last slide, which really picks up on points that Pavel was talking about. He felt that he wasn't being. If we move right on to the end, sorry. Help and support with moving on. Pavel had said to us earlier on that he felt that he wasn't taken seriously. And we've heard from other adults and young people with experience of our systems that they felt they haven't been listened to. And if they have been listened to, they haven't been heard. And if they have been heard, then their calls for action haven't been acted upon. So that's what we're really hoping to do through this strategic board, is to engage young people in influencing and shaping the policy in terms of what happens next. The young people's evidence that they have given is just as valid as the expert research, which also underpins the next steps in terms of what we do next with secure care. And finally, in the words of the young people who spoke to us, young people were saying to us, look at what we've achieved despite everything we've been through. So we need to recognise that young people who've experienced the level of trauma that leads to them needing to be secured and detained in care for their own safety or for that of others are young people who have incredible resilience, who have incredible capacity, incredible potential, and we should actually be celebrating that, and we should be promoting that. And we hope to do that by involving them in shaping the future of secure care in Scotland. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Marian and Alison. Thanks to both of you for your presentations, for sharing your experience with us, an experience that I have very much appreciated, in particular because you reminded us of the difference between a troublesome and a trouble kid, which I think it's very important to keep in mind. And you reminded us about the fact that behind an angry kid, there is a vulnerable kid, which is something that anyone working in this field should have very present at all times. But also acknowledging the fact that this type of interventions that you are carrying on are expensive interventions, costly, and that therefore they need to be done efficiently and with an aim of making a real difference for the life of these children. And with that, we are swiftly moving to our last panelist, the last panelist of a very long morning that is going to bring us back from the practical level that we have just been discussing to the, I have to say, now the most, the broadest, the widest policy level. Our speaker is Mr. Danius Puras, who is a professor for child psychiatry and public mental health at the Vilnius University. But most importantly is the special UN rapporteur with a very long title on the right to everyone to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of health, which
mental and physical health.
I am amazed to learn that actually this exists, but I hope that you are going to let us know everything about it. So the floor is yours for the next 15 minutes.
Thank you. I started many years ago, and I was loaded then in early 80s, still in Soviet Union, when I could see pictures of, could see children in horrible institutions, including in child psychiatric units, where they were brought just to as a punishment. And then this European and international experience, now I can compare Europe with other regions. Of course, Europe is a leader, but one of paradoxes is that Europe has highest rate of institutionalized people I mean children and adults. So this means that the problem is not in lack of resources, but something with context and attitudes. And I just remind of what I was talking yesterday. This we need to take on our side many more people, both in general public, but also important decision makers and professionals on the side of human rights-based approach. Because what is failing is because these basic principles are usually ignored, consciously or not consciously. And I yesterday gave some examples on good practices in the early childhood, which is crucial, as we know, and adolescence, which is one more very important moment in life of everyone. Today I want more to reflect on issues around mental health. One of complications is about terminology and this very broad spectrum of different kind of conditions. I even don't know which conditions fall under CRPD, for example, and which do not, because there are many conditions which, let's say, children babies who are taken to baby homes, in some countries still they are immediately diagnosed as having disability, even if they do not have it. They are just come there because of some social problems in family. But even these institutions are called in some countries, the official title is the baby home of babies with developmental disability. So it means they have no right even not to make diagnosis to these children, because they still play the game of medical institution. So here the problem and medicalization starts. Then either with intellectual disability or without intellectual disability, these children very often present different behavioral and emotional problems, and we know why, because they lived in institution or because they lived in broken home, in abusive family. But if country does not have network of support services, they move to medicalization usually. And my concern is, and I raised this in my thematic report on mental health, that this failure of psychiatry, of general psychiatry, may reach child psychiatry. I mean, general adult psychiatry is now dominated by biological model. Child psychiatry, child adolescent psychiatry is trying to be more psychosocial, but still more and more literature we can find, that mental health conditions in children can be effectively managed with psychotropic medications. And even if this is used, let's say, maybe in moderate way in some older EU member states, it starts immediately to be overused in East and Central Europe, because of problems with medical ethics, because of corruption, and so on. So medicalization in Central Eastern Europe is heavier than in other countries. And this combination of institutionalization and medicalization, they fuel each other. They are both reflect I think they mostly reflect some hopelessness and failure, policy failure. And then it's not about just bad people who make wrong decisions. Just it's failure of policies, and because usually we hear argument, but there is no other option. No other option to institutionalize, to medicalize, to do both. These children who stay in care homes, they are often acting out. After each acting out, they are brought to psychiatric hospital. And I know children, adolescents who have been in psychiatric hospital 30 times, 40 times. It's a violation of their rights, and it's a waste of resources also. But this is because of gaps in in system of services. One of the question I would like to raise in this regard is this comparison between different parts of Europe. And we know that each country has achievements and each country has, let's say, challenges and problems. My estimation is that some countries in Central Eastern Europe still have not reached level of, let's say, Western Europe level of 60s, of 1960s. I speak about community-based services. So the problem is this vision lost forever, or shall we ask or require or recommend still to have, let's say, normal community-based and family-focused services for families who have children with different kind of problems, because now it's mainly under healthcare sector, and the healthcare sector is medicalized, and they do not want to spend money on so-called therapeutic, interventions. This concept is even unknown in some countries or ignored. Those who have money, they can receive like family interventions, but the government will not cover, will cover very minimal. And then we have problem like, for example, if there is a child with autistic spectrum disorder, with autism in family, in some of these East and Central countries, the governmental official will simply tell, we are not Sweden, we are not Germany, we will never afford all these, luxury interventions, because yes, for some autistic children, you really need, I should say, expensive interventions, and there is no even discussion going on if something like, I don't know, applied behavior analysis or some other intervention will be covered or not. Of course not, and there is some hint to such families that you can emigrate. You can go to other countries, because we are not that rich country to cover all these interventions. Of course, the same countries have money for institutional care, so this is not, again, not so much about quantity of resources, is more about quality and understanding. I should say it's a problem still to convince policymakers in big part of Europe about investing in quality of human relationships. Either it's a child with disability or without disability, these families, they themselves often ask just money and medications, and this is what government only can promise and afford and do. One example from what I mean by this tendency to medicalization. This example is this time from developed country, not from Central Eastern Europe, but classical, that the girl with severe disability, intellectual plus autistic features, is in school, it is okay, and parents come to take her from school, and teacher tells, tomorrow don't bring her here, bring to doctor, because something happened, something, something with behavior, something with emotions. It was very difficult to manage. And parents ask, so what happened? And teacher tells, so I don't know what happened. You have to see doctor. Doctor will tell what happened. And parents told me this story, and the story was about that for parents it took like 15 seconds to diagnose the situation. This was, in this case, this was a small stone in the shoe. But this example shows that even teacher can be not immune from this, biomedical model, which means that if a child has some diagnosis, everything what will happen with this child, we will we will make decision that this is because something wrong happened in brain, and then we have to go to medical place to fix this disorder. So this leads to very wrong investments, very wrong decision, and my last thinking during last months after I made this mental health report to Human Rights Council is that it may be that wrong messages come from developed countries to Central Eastern Europe, because my colleagues, doctors, they very easily get a confirmation of biomedical informations in UK, in Germany, in Sweden, in Norway. This is what modern psychiatry and child psychiatry is about, and this can be some vicious cycle to continue this failure of, I should say, biological psychiatry, which is not friendly to human rights. Among my recommendations is that, of course, we don't speak much about the health sector in this meeting, I understand, but we should somehow send a message about to pediatrics, to child adolescent psychiatry, that they should embrace child rights approach and not so easily to regress to all this medicalization. But also one more issue I would like to raise is about, shall I call it institutionalization at home? It's not legal term, but you know that many parents will tell, okay, we get disability pension, we will keep our child at home. We don't need school. And doctors will write some paper that, yes, this is too difficult case for school, let this child stay at home. I think it can be equal to institutionalization, because the child loses most important things, socialization with peers and so on. So there are many phases of such failures. Of course, there are many good practices in many countries, we know. Some things move better, some things move not so well. One of my conclusions is that if child does not have, let's say, challenging behavior, it can be quite okay in many countries. Like I know in my country, children with Down syndrome enjoy. I think they are almost fully rehabilitated. And I mean, it can be even inclusive education. But if child, even with not so severe intellectual disability, but if child has some emotional, some challenging behavior, then all these policy failures start, that all community-based services will tell, sorry, we don't accept such cases. We don't know what to do with them. And here I would like to ask for best practices from more developed countries, how to manage these cases. So thank you.
Many thanks for that presentation, which was really rich and full of insights, but of which I would like to keep with me this sentence that we need to invest on quality human relationships. I think that a lot of problems in the world would be solved if we would just do that one thing. So it's now 10 to 1. We have some time, not a lot of time, but some time to open the dialogue. And if we go 5 minutes over the time, no one will realize, apart from ourselves and our stomachs. But first of all,
open the floor first, and then I'll speak afterwards.
Yeah, okay. So this time we'll do it the other way around. We open the floor first, and then Jana will wrap up the discussion. So same instructions as before. State your name and organization, speak on the microphone, and be concise, and let us know for which panelist your question is. Please.
Good morning. My name is Alexandra Lima. I come from Portugal, Lisbon. I represent an organization that is a middle public, middle private one. It's a different kind. And my question is, I wonder if the way claimed for investment in new services in the community, instead of sending children to residential care on one side, and in the other way, we noticed through information passed here these days that the institutional care of children is being a severe problem for all of us, for our societies. I wonder, how do we go from in the other hand, the last panelist stood up in the differences between Central and East Europe and West Europe. I wonder, how do we go from one side to the other without a middle term of quality? Is that possible, that we go from a system with a big, significant number of residential care to another one, as the one that was presented here through our colleague from Italy, that the care is provided through services of community? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. I see one there and one here.
My name is Kart Mere and I am from European Anti-Poverty Network. Thank you for the interesting presentations. I would like to highlight the importance of good preparation, good skills, and also emotional and willingness to support the child for the support persons and personal assistance, because these are the people who have to work together with family, together with other specialists, and also the main important work they have to support the child. And I think that assistance work should be recognized as a quality work and be well regulated and well paid. And I am pretty sure that in many countries it is very difficult to find a good assistant. And we should concentrate more about little bit to highlight in the policy framework. Thank you.
My own question, actually, my name is Seamus Mannion. I am from Ireland, and I'm here representing an organisation that is involved in keeping young people out of institutions and keeping them within their communities. And my observation actually nicely spurs off Alexandra's, because I also was trying to think about how you make this transition from buildings, which everybody can see and relates to very quickly, to community services, which are so disparate that are very hard to see and hard to explain your justification and your benefits of investment. So I understand this problem very well. I used to work in hospitals and then I worked in communities, so I realized the issues. But it seems to me that you also have a lot of work done in the EU about good practices, community-based practices. You've identified the key principles that go to effective interventions. All this work has been done many times. And this is the same thing I think you are looking for in community interventions that you are encouraging us to move towards and fund. So it seems that perhaps what you need to do is the left hand needs to work with the right hand, so you have one body of work that might address your issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I have heard that before. Another question.
Thank you. I'm Lazar from Mental Disability Rights Initiative of Serbia, and I would like to go back, I think maybe 2 hours, and reflect on something that Mr. Andor said in his presentation. Well, I see a bit problematic and maybe even harmful the policy of putting or considering the institutionalization of persons with disabilities in the framework of poverty reduction for the next programming period. And also, Serbia as a country candidate for EU, we experience this problem because it's under the Chapter 19, which is on in the EU acquis on the Chapter 19 is social policy and employment, and it's not put in the Chapter 23, which is absolutely essential, and it's a chapter for considering justice and fundamental rights. And this is something that directly hinders the deinstitutionalization in Serbia, because in this way it loses its importance, literally, on a very practical level. And I'm asking now, since deinstitutionalization is directly and indirectly violating most fundamental rights, such as right to liberty, equal recognition before the law, privacy, confidentiality, and also implications of DI, implications of institutionalization such as torture, inhuman degrading treatment, ill treatment, etc. How is this, what is the line of reasoning? What is the justification of putting this question in the policies, in this basket of poverty reduction from the human rights point of view? Thank you.
Thanks for your question. So I will give now the floor back to the panel. Who wants to start? Maybe addressing the joint Portuguese and Irish question.
I'm happy to do.
Please.
So, we have a 5-day training program on how to make that transition. And I can't summarize a 5-day training program in 30 seconds, and so I won't attempt to do so. What I want to say is that there is good training available and there is guidance available on how to make the transition. I would say that there are 3 key components to moving away from an institutional system to one that is based on community-based services. And the first one is political will. If we do not get cross-party support at the political level, at national level and at local government level, we will never make this change happen, because every change of government and every change of local authority will try to throw out what the previous government was doing before, because that's what politicians do. They say that everything that went before them was rubbish and we're going to start from scratch. And to make a real transition will take at least 10 years. So it needs a 10-year plan. It will go beyond the life of any one single term of government. And so political will is very important. How you build political will, we also have some training and guidance on that I'd be very happy to share with anybody who's interested. The second thing that's needed is money. Now, we know that money is, there's plenty of money in the institutional system, and our analysis of finances from low, middle and high income countries shows that the family and community-based services, including those for children with disabilities, are cheaper than even the poor quality institutions. So there is enough money currently in the system of running institutions to run a whole range of community-based health, education and social service social services that will replace the institutions and will probably then reach out to providing support for up to 10 times as many children who are currently not receiving services. So the money is there, but the transition process itself costs money because it requires additional personnel. And this is always dramatically underestimated in my experience. People think that this change is just going to happen, and it will not. I was running a deinstitutionalization program in northwest Romania, helping the government to close down 3 institutions, which between them housed 750 kids in a period of 18 months, which was too fast, but it was imposed. I had a team of 40 people managing that process, and that was in addition to the local authority people who were working on it. And towards the end of that process, we were working 18 hours a day, 6 days a week to make it happen. So there is a dramatic underestimate of the capacity needed, both in terms of volume of people to do this right, but also the skill sets that are needed to transition. So investment in the money and that transition process is a really important part of it. Now, the problem is people think that we're talking about investment in buildings, as Danius was saying earlier on. You do need some buildings to house some services, but the real investment is in that big team of people who are going to manage that change. This is actually what the ESIF funds are for in terms of deinstitutionalisation. They're not for building beautiful, big, lovely houses in the countryside. They are for managing this transition process and putting in place the service infrastructure needed to replace institutions. So any country that's got access to the structural funds, if you are interested in making the transition from institutional to community-based services, the money is there. There is also guidance because the European Expert Group worked together to produce guidance on how to use the structural funds to make the transition from institutional to community-based services. And we as a group provided training. And I'm sure that if people wanted training again, Jana, I can't speak for the group, but we would go back to the group, wouldn't we, and say, look, others are asking for training on how to do this, so let's put that in place. So guidance, so the capacity is a key part of it, the professional capacity to do it, the funding for the transition, and the political will. Those are the three things you need in place. Anyone who wants more information on how to make the transition, the European Expert Group, I know, would be very happy to help provide that, and Lumos would be happy to help provide it.
Thanks a lot. I think that was clear. Andor, on the issue of Serbia?
Yeah. I'm not sure that... Can we open actually my presentation again for a second, just because it's probably easier to explain you and to give you an answer actually. Because you're absolutely right. I'm not following very much actually what's happening in Serbia about the accession.
Well, it's obviously European Union-wide problem.
No, it's okay. It's fine. So can you go just to the? Can you go over? Maybe I can use the. Yeah, I can use this one. So it should be okay. Right. Just give me 1 second. Okay, here. So what we ask from member states to focus on both angles, the human rights perspective and the poverty reduction. Okay, the human rights perspective comes from the anti-discrimination and from the disability ex-ante conditionalities, and the poverty reduction angle is coming actually like a policy angle. What are the policy measures to tackle the poverty in your country, including the deinstitutionalization? So the human rights perspective is there, absolutely there. And actually now we see more, let's say, instruments and more room for maneuvering actually in the human rights perspective than in the policy. Why? Because the policy is, it's a bit kind of weak instrument if you compare it to, for example, to the Charter of Fundamental Rights or to the UNCPRD. That's why I was using actually in my presentation the two, if I can find it somewhere, I'm not sure. Yeah, here, the two very important legal instruments, what we can use in respect of the funding, that these are, let's say, very strong instruments, what you have to respect when you are implementing actually the structural funds. So this is there. So the answer to your question, if I understand well, the human rights perspective, the human rights requirement when you are implementing the funds is ensured by these legal instruments. And Serbia should also actually follow it in the context of the pre-accession funds. When they are using actually the pre-accession funds, they have to also follow, in particular, actually the Charter of Fundamental Rights. Okay?
Use the microphone if you want to react.
Well, I'm concerned that human rights-based approach is here put on a kind of a second place. You see, because it's extremely important in the pre-accession charter, chapter 23, justice and fundamental rights is one of the, maybe even the most important one, right? Social and policy employment, chapter 19 is somewhere else, 10th, I don't know, it's not important anyways. In this very practical, political point of view, human rights-based approach is definitely put on a lower, much lower level than it should be. and that in this way the countries, especially countries in the process of accession, are managing to just skip the institutionalization, because you have to really implement the things from the chapter 23, while chapter 19 is still kind of it just like this in practice. It's a bit loosened, right?
I think there's a bit of misunderstanding here, but maybe I don't understand the full scope. Regardless of the European funds, let's forget about the funds. Member states, they have responsibility to implement the UNCPRD because they ratified it. Serbia, I mean, if I understand well, Serbia also ratified the UNCPRD. Regardless of the funding, they have to follow the instructions and they have to report to the UN. So it means that, I mean, the human rights perspective in the accession procedure should be there, and you can use actually the UNCPRD as a legal instrument here, and the report to the UN should be kind of brought up saying that, okay, how Serbia is reporting back to the UN, what are, let's say, your perspectives actually here. So please use the UNCPRD as much as possible you can. This is my personal advice, regardless of the funding, okay?
Thanks a lot. If there are remaining issues, maybe you can take it up bilaterally. Anyone who want to briefly react to the issue raised by EAPN on the availability of care?
Yes, I think the point that quite a lot of us have made is it's not a question of trying to ameliorate what's become a very difficult and in some cases a situation which you are not going to do enough good in the time available to effect the kind of change you need to. I think the skill level of the people who are offering support is critical. And in some ways, while I think the buildings are important and clearly the kind of institutional settings are known to be very damaging, I think that the skill and capacity of people who are offering support to form stable, consistent and caring relationships is the thing that probably matters most. And I'm emphasising caring because I think children and young people, and I'm sure the young people who spoke to Alison make this very clear, that a duty of care is not the same as actually caring. And what makes the difference is feeling that somebody has actually got your best interests at heart and will protect that in a consistent way. And that includes offering support to families. And I think the other thing is, and I think this is where it ties in with poverty, by no means all the young people that we spoke to were from families experiencing poverty, but the vast majority were. And I think we cannot underestimate the effects of poverty, the direct effects on your well-being, your mental health, the stress that young people are subject to and the difficulties that that puts parents in. And I think if we don't actually recognise their financial needs as well as their support needs, then I think we'll continue to get it wrong.
Thank you very much, Marion, for that. I am really sorry that I don't have the possibility to continue taking questions from the audience, but I'm afraid we're already over the time allocated to this workshop, and I still would like to give the floor to Jana for some wrap-up considerations. Quick one.
Thank you, Raquel. And I'm also sorry that we didn't manage to have the time for a debate. So my intervention would be, okay, well, let's look at follow-up, because there are a lot of people in this room who are very interested and very committed to thinking about how we can help the European Union deliver on putting the priority on children's rights and human rights. So we've talked about the European Expert Group. We're a group of, I think, 12 different networks representing different interest groups. Get in touch with us. If you're active at national level, there are ways and means of ensuring that there's constant information flow between what's happening at national level and what's happening at EU level. I think the consistent message here is there is no country that has achieved perfect child welfare and protection system, even in Scotland. And I really admire what you're managing to do, and the political will, which Georgette talked about, is there. But there is still many, many issues to be addressed. So every country has challenges. And what we were trying to do is to say that this needs to be the top priority of the EU, and that's a very difficult challenged to get, as Lazar said. It's seen not as the top, but as somewhere. And what we're saying is that you cannot achieve economic prosperity, success in employment, and all of those top-level objectives if you do not take a human rights approach. And many things have been said here about just money being misused. This is incorrect use of the resources and the capacity that we have in the European Union. Next week, I have the privilege of being in Gothenburg at the Heads of State Summit, where they will be proclaiming the pillar of social rights. Unfortunately, it has been framed in a very narrow perspective of jobs and employment, and that is not where we want the European Union to go. The pillar of social rights is about creating a vision for Europe where everybody has their place, that this is around social inclusion, around human rights, around human dignity. And the work that we're doing in these 2 days is absolutely fundamental. If we get it right for the most vulnerable in our societies, we will get it right for society as a whole. And that is the message that we need to be collectively selling to our political masters as loud as we possibly can. Thank you very much. Again, apologies that we have not had time for political debate, but please use the lunch and
Well, I think that on this note, we can consider that the workshop is closed now. Have a good lunch.
Thank you.